Thank you. I'm also do a couple of other things. I'm on the board of directors for the UN Global Partnership for Sustainable Development and advisor to the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund's laboratory on long-term investment, as well as advisor to the OECD and people like that. And I've started a number of companies. So what Bob talked about was really interesting. And what I want to do is avoid all of that, okay? First of all, just let me mention that we have a paper that came out in Nature, so like the premier thing, Monday, which talked about all of these sort of culture wars and shows that the major thing that causes culture wars are not facts, it's assertions about people's intentions. Those guys are going to kill our babies, that sort of thing, right? In law, intentions are one of the hardest things to prove because there's no real record of it. It happens in your head. But it fires people up. So politicians, anybody who wants to create emotion, uses claims about intentions. So what you should try and do is anytime there is a claim about intention, you should just turn your brain off and not listen to it and just look at the facts. And it turns out that if you take people and you run them through what are the intentions of the other side and you get the real facts in front of them, they change how they vote. They change much more centrist. A lot of the hate goes away. There's not a small effect either. It's like a 30% effect. It's amazing. So check it out, okay? About 10 years ago, I started looking at data and how data could be something that would affect how we govern ourselves. And this was actually a follow-on of earlier work where we were looking at wearable tech. We built prototypes of cell phones before there were cell phones, things like that. And I realized there were good parts and bad parts. So I started a discussion at Davos, World Economic Forum, that resulted in GDPR, actually. I was sort of lucky to have influence there. And then following that, we focused on the good part. And we looked at how data can help you do things like identify poverty, look at economic growth, things like that. But unconventional data, not financial data, right? Because there was all these new sorts of data coming in there. And that attracted a lot of attention. And when the UN wanted to put together the Sustainable Development Goals, the Secretary General named a bunch of people to be data revolutionaries. And I was one of those, to help them advise on how do you measure progress on the Sustainable Development Goals? Because it had occurred to them that if you don't measure things, they won't happen, okay? So how do you measure? I mean, maybe poverty is easy, but what about environmental things, water, ocean? What about inequality, gender? There's a bunch of things that are in the Sustainable Development Goal. Incidentally, they're not controversial. They could go into SDGs, but nobody says we shouldn't have water. I mean, come on, right? And the water should be clean. Everybody agrees with that. It's not political. So measuring that is not controversial. Everybody agrees that extreme poverty is bad, right? And you shouldn't let people starve to death in the streets. This is just not good, okay? And so the elements of this, very concrete elements of SDG, are not controversial. So just don't talk about SDGs. Don't talk about ESG. Talk about these concrete things and talk about concretely what you're going to do with them in ways that, get a lot more support and are quantifiable. So that's the SDG thing. Here's the 17 SDGs. A sort of funny story is, as a data revolutionary, you would go to the UN, where they have all these guys with machine guns, because, the presidents and stuff there, right? And you say, I'm a data revolutionary. And the guys with the guns would go, right? Like, oh, Like, no, 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 really, it's a real thing. Don't worry about it. See, I got a card. But the goal of this group was to sort of round up support for measuring all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are several parts to this. One is you have to figure out how you're going to measure these things. You also have to think about using them in governance and planning. And then you also have to think about auditing them. Because it's one thing to say, well, here's the truth, here's a way to do it. But if you don't pay attention to it over time, it isn't going to happen. And this is different than finance in one really important way, is that you've got 17 things to optimize here, not one. With money, you optimize one, right? You want more money. But what happens if you want more money and fewer dead kids? I mean, just to pick something at random, right? You have to begin to trade them. And that's a political question. You have to accept a certain amount of, maybe not dead kids, but a certain amount of inequality versus poverty alleviation versus clean water. There will be trade-offs. There's only so many resources out there. Our techniques are not perfect. And so that debate is something that I and we wanted to avoid. Every country had to decide for itself how they were going to trade these things off. And the hope was that global norms would emerge. So let's just go through these sort of quickly. So measuring, the first thing you have to be able to know is what's going on. And one of the striking things that people don't know is that it's connections between people that turn out to be the critical determinants of almost all of these. It's not education, the things between your ears. It's not money. It's not all those other things we think about. It's, do you talk to diverse other people? Do you have access to opportunities? Do you know people who can get things done? And so it's these flows of people between neighborhoods that allow you to do that. It's like, well, okay, so where do people work? Where do they play? Who do they go out and eat with? Surprisingly, that is for instance, I'll show you, a better predictor of most of the things you care about than the things that you think about and measure today. So for instance, just give me an example, and these don't have to be about individual people. That's the other thing that's really interesting. You can do this on census blocks. So you can say, how integrated is this neighborhood with other neighborhoods? Where do the people in this neighborhood work? Those are the information that you're looking at. It is not personal data. It's like census data. But let me just show you some things. So for instance, in Beijing, we looked at these patterns of interaction between the 900 different administrative neighborhoods in Beijing. And we were able to predict year-on-year GDP growth more accurately than the sort of standard things you'd look at, which would be transportation network, investment, and so forth. In fact, these patterns predict almost 50% of the variance. I don't know how many nerdy people are who think about variance, but 50% of the variance is really good, okay? And that's after controlling for all the factors you normally think about. And there's a paper if you're interested in that. Turns out you can also predict crime rates. You can predict things like what percentage of kids will grow up to be successful. Turns out, I mean, a simple way to think about this is ghettos are bad. You don't want to live in a ghetto. You don't want to have ghettos in your cities. What you want to have is and you don't want the poor people to only talk to the poor people and the rich people to only talk to the rich people. You need to have this sort of connection between all of the people so that ideas, new techniques, new ways of living transmit themselves. And particularly, this is relevant for very young children. And in this country, for instance, studies have shown that areas that are kids who grow up in highly segregated areas, by the time they're 5 or 6, if they're still living there, about 50%, their outcomes have been reduced by about 50%, the likelihood of their outcomes. It's enormously harmful to have ghettos. But we don't even know that information in America, where we tend to measure lots of stuff. In most places in the world, you don't have it at all. But there are ways of getting this information. You can get this out of cell phone companies. You can get it out of payment systems. You can get it out of many sort of things. And if you aggregate it, it's no longer dangerous. That's the core message. So for instance, we did studies in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, in Italy, in the UK, and since then, that was before the SDGs were put together, and since then we've done them in all the continents, except for Antarctica, and you find these same patterns. There are certain patterns of communication and mixing that are just absolute ways of identifying poverty, pockets of poverty that are missed by other methods, because these are for very small neighborhoods. Inequality, you can identify that. You can identify gender issues because the women behave differently than the men. You can optimize transport. You can actually show huge effects in public health. So for instance, in COVID, we saw a really big differences between poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods, but a huge amount of that was accounted for by what they were exposed to. Where did they go? Where did they work? Not access to hospitals. It was how they're exposed to other things in their day-to-day life. We say the same things with pollution and so on and so forth. And what that allows you to do is take these alternative sources of data and, as a political process, say, where am I going to invest to get greater income growth, reduce inequality, extreme poverty, raise public health, and guess what? You got to trade those off against each other, right? There is not enough money in the universe to do them all perfectly. Maybe eventually, but it's going to be a long haul. And some examples of the type of thing that you do. This is by some friends in London. So what they wanted to do is ask, where should we put in a new subway line? And what they did is they modeled all the different layers of transportation, foot traffic, public, cars. And then they said, well, if we put a line that's a horizontal subway line, what we find is you can make, so the green areas over here, these horizontal extremes of London actually have really significant growth in income, right? Because they have greater access to opportunity. On the other hand, the vertical guys lose, right? And the reason they lose is that their opportunity is being taken by the guys on the other edges, okay? So they were proposed putting a vertical subway line in also. And then you get pretty uniform growth, right? Not completely uniform. So for instance, for Singapore now, we're working on with them to be able to say, if you're going to change transportation, how can you do it in a way that benefits the poorest neighborhoods, that promotes mixing between different cultures, big problem in Singapore, and so on and so forth. It's not just a matter of making the subways or the transportation faster, which is what we tend to do today. You also want to make the outcomes in society better for the longer term. And it's a trade-off. But you might not go quite as fast, but you help the poorer communities. Okay? We did some examples of this, for instance, in the little country of Andorra, which is between Spain and France. It's a mountain country. Their main thing is tourism, and they were having things like Cirque du Soleil show up, right? And so all the tourists would come. But what happened is they clogged the roads. It was bad for everything else. And only one town where the show was made any money. Everybody else was saying, well, this actually hurt us because the roads were all clogged. So what we did is we built models of, who went where, how congested were the roads, what was the level of pollution, et cetera, so that they could, in a scientific way, plan what sort of events they should hold. Like, are they bicycle competitions? Turns out bicycle competitions are really good because they move around. So people go to the different places and they stay for a long time, where Cirque du Soleil was not so good. A lot of people showed up, they left the same day, only one town made money, and the roads were terrible. A lot of pollution, a lot of accidents and so forth. So you can begin looking at this and planning your economy, not just for the money, but for inclusiveness, for side effects, and that, of course, is a political process, right? Who's going to benefit? So how do you actually do that political process? Well, we had the Inter-American Development Bank ask us to help them in the cases of Mexico, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Brazil, because they had payment systems. These are for young women that had young kids, right? And if you took your kids to clinic and the kids went to school, then you got a paycheck every other week, okay? Pretty good. But the criteria they had and the outreach they had for it tended to ignore native populations. It also had a rural-urban divide. And so they were concerned about this, that it was reinforcing inequality, even though it was helping kids. And so what we did is we built a tool that looked at who got how much money, and we did this by essentially building a little AI tool that looked at what in this country is called the American Community Survey. So this is, they have a little focus group of 3,000 families where they visit them and they write down everything about the family, who lives with them, do they have running water, blah, blah, blah. And then you can ask in simulation, if we adopt this policy, who wins and who loses? And the political trade-off is that, you know, we got only so much money, maybe we can stretch a little bit more, but what level of urban-rural divide is acceptable? Because it costs more to do certain things than other things. Or in another sort of example is, what sort of native population versus more sort of Spanish-speaking population are you reaching, right? It's clear you'd like to reach everybody, but you don't have the resources to do that. In Colombia, we found an interesting thing, which is that their social support system missed almost 1 million people that should have been getting social support. On the other hand, it was giving social support to 1 million people who shouldn't be getting it because they were too wealthy. So obviously, I just switch. Think about that for about 10 seconds and you realize this is a recipe for a revolution, right? Tell 1 million people. So what they did is they changed the rules going forward to be much more inclusive. And in 5 or 6 years, they'll be better. But they avoided having an uprising in the middle. So a thing that I've been saying since these experiences is that you need to think of data as something more than just this sort of exhaust of the systems. Data is now a primary means of production. So in our cultures, land was the mean of production forever, right? So for maybe 5,000 years. And then we had industry, and labor became commodified. And it was a primary means of production. And at about the same time, capital, around 500 or so, capital became formalized in terms of banking and things we see today, things we call finance. And of course, famously, Marxism was the battle between capital and labor, right? Now data is another formal and primary means of production. That is something you have to sleep on for a long time to realize how crazy that is. But you notice the name I put at the end of that quote. So this is the head of China, okay? This is the loudest and most important voice of Marxism in the world, right? And this is something he said. So in China, data is a primary means of production. So if you talk about sustainable finance, you had better talk about sustainable data and finance and capital and land and labor, because those are the means of production now. If you leave data out, you've like missed the big one, as it were. How are you going to deal with this? Well, the core problem, obviously, is just like with money or land, no one's going to give this to you, right? It's going to remain in little silos, so you've got a problem. What are we to do? So, sort of think about this as being, 1400, and, there were these sort of minor royalty that were everywhere, and they owned the land, and everybody worked for them, right? And then factories where the factory owner, paid you $1 a week, and you had to work 12 hours a day, and your kids were, okay. We're sort of in that with respect to data. We need to begin having institutions. And just as we did with labor, just as we did with capital, you need institutions to represent you, because it's complicated. And if you go up and you talk to somebody and say, I want my data to do this, they'll laugh at you. It's just ridiculous. On the other hand, if 100 million of us sort of went up to somebody and said, we're not going to buy your stuff anymore unless you treat our data correctly, they will listen, assuming you have some sort of reasonable proposition. And so what you see around the world is data ownership rights are being established. So GDPR, HIPAA is, I always get these mixed up. One's Korea, one's India, and the CCPA is California. People are beginning to say, no, actually, there are rights to this. And this is sort of early stage. This is like, the first step. Along with this, what you need is community institutions that are responsive to citizens. What's an example of that? An example of that is a community bank or an agricultural co-op, where they don't own your money, they don't own your farm. What they do is they help manage it and represent it to other forces, right? We're familiar with what this happened, like in this country. In the late 1800s, you got community banks fighting against the East Coast banks. You got labor unions shortly after that fought against the industrialists. And eventually things reached some sort of an equilibrium. And I think that's what we need to happen here. And we're beginning to see this, actually. And we could talk more about it, is this sort of notion of, you have a data bank. So Google or Facebook doesn't actually talk to you anymore. It talks to your representative. Just like when you pay for something, they don't actually contact you, they contact your bank, which is representing you, okay? And that means the bank can have fairly sophisticated policies to know if it's a scam, is this really in your interest, blah, 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 can demand things for you, not just money. So people talk about financialization of data. I'd rather have my kids be healthy. Do you know about the health in your neighborhood? No, because the hospital controls that. They don't share with you how many people got COVID or diabetes or whatever. I mean, do you know how crazy that is? Like, for instance, in the area that I live, there's a little town where somebody noticed, just a random individual, that more women were getting breast cancer than should. And they noticed that through notifications in the newspapers. The hospitals knew this too. They have all that data, right? But they're not looking out for you, right? And so this person went on a little bit of a sleuthing, and it was discovered that the person who managed the lawns and put weed killer on the lawns was using a carcinogenic substance. And that's why women were dying of breast cancer in this town. Now, frankly, I want my hospital to look out for me, but the only way that's going to happen is if we can see what data they have. I mean, I know they're nice people and all that stuff, but, okay? So this is a different way of thinking about data, and this is something that we're seeing spreading in different places. So for instance, we have contracts with Australia, just signed something with Indonesia, talking with Luxembourg, we've helped Switzerland put in place data systems that operate differently. So the way you think about it, particularly if you're in Silicon Valley, is this company sucks all the data from the people into one place, right? And then does magic stuff that you can't account for. That also is why data breaches are so important, because you've got a honeypot there. All that data is in one spot. Okay? So the model that we're talking about is you have fiduciaries that answer questions rather than share data. Okay? So almost all the things you want to do can be done by a question and answering system, as opposed to give me your data. Now, in a government, this is really important, or in a company, this is really important. You have all these parts of the company. If you go to them and say, will you give me your data to be able to do this thing? They'll say, no. If I give you the data, I'll be out of a job. Or it's against the law. If it's a hospital, they'll say, oh, no, this is privacy. We can't possibly share, right? But they will answer questions, and your legal team will even let you do that. And we've done that, for instance, with the banks. We helped Fidelity and the largest banks set up a system like this where when you move retirement accounts and things around, it used to be what they did is they asked for your login credentials. They would log in as pretending to be you. They would scrape all of your data off the screen. I'm serious, this is the way it worked, right? And then they would, identify that you had what was required to blah. It's like, this is a nightmare, right? In terms of data privacy. But that was the way the world worked. We helped them set up something where now Bank A, who's gonna get this, or investment thing A that's gonna get this money, asks questions of the place that you currently have money. Do they have enough money? Or do you know who they actually are? Have you done anti-money laundering on them? And the one bank where you currently are says yes, no, within a legal contract. So they're on the hook for assuring that everything is good. And only then do things move. Okay? So there's no trading the data, just attestations about what's correct or not. An example of this being a good idea is we set this up 2 years later, 70% of all bank accounts in the whole US use this. More than half of credit cards use this. Right? And that data is a little old at this point. We are familiar with this. You do this every day. You do this several times a day, probably. When you put your phone out and you buy something, the way it works is it generates a routing number, a one-time number, and the dollar amount that you're going to buy. Okay? And the routing number goes to your bank. The merchant doesn't have to know what the bank is, right? The bank doesn't know what you're buying. Might have some sort of general idea, right? Because sometimes they attach a little bit of codes to it. And then the bank says yes, no, and that comes back to the merchant. Merchant doesn't get to see your bank account. All the merchant gets is yes or no. Okay, so this is data minimization. It's not like they know who you are and what your money is and all. No, it's all minimized, right? So these are attestations from a place where you have who's holding your data, because it has to, the bank, right? And you give them permission. So they can now use your money in other places. And you can do this with other things. Like, for instance, during COVID, it's a better example 2 years ago than it is now, people said, well, were you vaccinated? And I'd put my phone down, right? And what would happen is this message would go to the clinic that gave me a vaccination, and they'd say yes or no, and it would come back, and now the person knows that I was vaccinated, but doesn't know where I got vaccinated or what sort of shot or any of that other sort of stuff. It's just yes or no, right? Okay, privacy preserving. And you can do this with all sorts of things. And this has been noticed because if you look at systems that have this sort of completeness, which you see in certain countries already, right? So certain parts of China, certain parts of India even, it adds a huge amount to the GDP growth because things are more secure, the data is under control of the right people, it's much lower transaction costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We were talking about UPI in India. You know, I mean, when they buy things, they can buy things that are 2 or 3 cents on their phone through their quote unquote sort of credit card because there are no fees, right? It just clears. It's very, and it's immediate. It's not like 2 or 3 days later it settles. It's immediate. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing, right? It makes what we do look really bad. And so the sorts of systems that we're being asked to help set up now are things like this one that was set up by Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund. It's not Singapore, the government, it's their money-making unit together with JP Morgan, who is a money-making unit. And what they did is they set up a blockchain system that tokenizes things. In other words, it's little, digital signatures, right? No PDFs or any of that stuff that move around on this blockchain system for transferring money, for transferring things like customs documents, letters of credit, devices, I mean, things that you would buy and so forth. And for finance and for a green coin and the Swiss thing is run by their post office. It's sort of a stalking horse. It's a commercial service, but their idea is to have confidential banking come back along with confidential medicine, okay? And now we see other countries getting into this. So this is very much what we're doing for Australia, the discussion with Luxembourg and so forth. And of course, the leader in this is China. China is very far ahead of everybody in this, and they want to have this in the Belt and Road. Anyway, so I'm told we need to go quick, sorry. Hopefully this was interesting. There's lots of research that needs to be done here, causal filtering, finding out what, talking to what. You may not think that that's like a super thing, but it turns out this is really good for money laundering. And so, for instance, Israel has been able to use these types of techniques to really radically reform their money laundering and terrorism units. We do better statistical methods. It is crazy, like think about during COVID. Millions of people being treated with drug X, right? And we still don't know if drug X works. This is insane. It's because our current systems use really crappy, like the medical standard was, the original version of that was 1743, I think, and that's still being used today. And that's why we have meta studies and things that don't work. And then this is actually from Singapore. They've noticed that financial systems are no longer by themselves. And you may have noticed this too if you have anything to do with Silicon Valley Bank. So there we have social networks causing runs on the bank. We had Deutsche Bank wobbling. It was thought that that might have been a nation attacking the Deutsche Bank by causing panic among the depositors. Think about that for a minute, right? And of course, famously, supply lines and so forth. So you really have to now look much broader. This data becomes really key in understanding the financial systems. We have a thing for doing AI the same way, which I'm not going to describe, but transformers.mit.edu solves a lot of the problems, hopefully. And then we have, book, Building the New Economy. There's a free version online, MIT Press, and we did a thing for the UN, tried to envision the UN at age 100 and what it will be doing. And I think it's sort of interesting. I have a chapter in there. Shinzo Abe has a chapter. The Secretary General has a chapter. I mean, it's actually sort of interesting to see what people are thinking. And thank you.